Everyone. Welcome to another lecture. Last time we discussed several things, right? Firstly, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to determine whether they wanted to be free or enslaved, and that led to a lot of bloody conflicts. Speaking of bloody conflicts, we talked about how Preston Brooks beat the crap out of Charles Sumner in Congress because he talked shit about South Carolina and Brooks' cousin, and basically called slavery a prostitute, and the senators and stuff who supported the pimps of slavery, right? We also talked about Dred Scott and how unfortunately black people were relegated by the Supreme Court to property and thus could not sue for their freedom at the time. And finally, we discussed our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, who he was, starting to discuss what he did in the Civil War, but we're going to get a lot into that today. So firstly, we're going to start off with the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which I mentioned, right? We talked about his Peoria speech in 1854, sort of the first debates that these two had. The Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, when Lincoln was running to take Douglas's Senate seat in Illinois, but ultimately lost. These debates would set up Lincoln in the public eye as a viable candidate for president, so they're super important. And as you can see, here's Lincoln without his beard, and Douglas as well. Okay. So these are also called the Great Debates of 1858. Here is a picture of Lincoln making one of his speeches, and it's interesting because Lincoln's wearing white, right, sort of looking like the hero or whatever, and then Douglas is wearing black, looking sort of like a villain, so it's quite interesting how they were depicted. If you take a look at video A, the Sound Smart series, which you should be familiar with by now, did a short video explaining these debates, so you can feel free to check that out. So these are a series of 7 debates between Lincoln, the Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate from Illinois, and incumbent Senator Stephen Douglas, the Democratic Party candidate. Now, incumbent in politics means that that person is already in that position, right? So, for example, in this upcoming presidential election, President Trump is the incumbent, and Joe Biden is his challenger. So at the time, U.S. senators were elected by state legislatures. Thus, Lincoln and Douglas were trying for their respective parties to win control of the Illinois General Assembly. So this is important, right? Because whoever won, their political party was essentially take control over Illinois politics. The debates previewed the issues that Lincoln would face in the aftermath of his victory in the 1860 presidential election. Although Illinois was a free state, the main issue discussed in all 7 debates was slavery in the United States. In agreeing to the official debates, Lincoln and Douglas decided to hold one debate in each of the 9 congressional districts in Illinois. Because both had already spoken in 2, Springfield and Chicago, within a day of each other, they decided that their joint appearances would be held in the remaining 7 districts. Newspapers that supported Douglas edited his speeches to remove any errors made by the stenographers, aka the people who basically write down everything that you said during the speech, and to correct grammatical errors, while they left Lincoln's speeches in the rough form in which they had been transcribed, right? In the same way, pro-Lincoln papers edited Lincoln's speeches but left Douglas's text as reported. So basically, each side, each political party reported their guy's speech better than the other ones, right? Kind of petty. After winning a plurality of the voters but losing in the legislature, Lincoln edited the texts of all the debates and had them published in a book. The widespread coverage of the original debates and the popularity of the book led to Lincoln's nomination for the President of the United States by the 1860 Republican National Convention. The format for each debate was that one candidate spoke for 60 minutes, then the other candidate spoke for 90 minutes. And then the first candidate was allowed a 30-minute rejoinder, which means sort of circling back to that person so they could elaborate more on their points. The candidates alternated speaking first, and Douglas ultimately spoke first the most. So basically, these debates were important because they mainly argued over slavery, right? Stephen Douglas was pro-slavery, but more pro-slave owners, right? He believed that the southern states should have the right to decide whether they want slavery or not. Whereas Lincoln was anti-slavery, but he wasn't somebody who was going to get rid of slavery immediately, right? He was just like, slavery is wrong, it's going to end eventually, like, we all know this is going to happen. So let's take a look at passages from each of their speeches, okay? So I'll try to read this quickly. By the way, these are from different days, okay? They're not the same day. So Stephen Douglas on August 21st, 1858 said, "We are told by Lincoln that he is utterly opposed to the Dred Scott decision and will not submit to it for the reason that he says it deprives the Negro of the rights and privileges of citizenship." And I guess people laughed. "That is the first and main reason which he assigns for his warfare on the Supreme Court of the United States in his decision. I ask you, are you in favor of conferring upon the Negro the rights and privileges of citizenship?" And the audience says no. "Do you desire to strike out of our state constitution that clause which keeps slaves and free Negroes out of the state, and allow the free Negroes to flow in?" And they say never. "And cover your prairies with black settlements. Do you desire to turn this beautiful state into a free Negro colony?" The audience says no. "In order that when Missouri abolishes slavery, she can send 100,000 emancipated slaves into Illinois to become citizens and voters on an equality with yourselves." And they say never. "If you desire Negro citizenship, if you desire to allow them to come into the state and settle with the white man, if you desire them to vote on equality with yourselves and to make them eligible to office, to serve on juries, and to adjudge your rights, then support Mr. Lincoln and the Black Republican Party, who are in favor of the citizenship of the Negro." And they say never. "For one, I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. I believe this government was made on the white basis. I believe it was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their prosperity forever, and I am in favor of confining citizenship to white men, men of European birth and descent, instead of conferring it upon Negroes, Indians, and other inferior races." So basically, this is super duper duper racist, right? He's basically saying, well, if we free the slaves, then there's going to be all these free black people, and they might get the same rights as you. Do you want that? Right? And he's saying that everybody except for white people shouldn't be citizens because he thinks that they're inferior. And a lot of these people are agreeing with him. Yeah, that's Douglas. Can you imagine if he became president? Ugh. Now, this is what Lincoln said a little bit later on October 15th, 1858. He said, "I have intimated that I thought the agitation would not cease until a crisis should have been reached and passed. I have stated in what way I thought it would be reached and passed. I have said that it might go one way or the other. We might, by arresting the further spread of it and placing it where the fathers originally placed it, put it where the public mind should rest in the belief that it was in the course of ultimate extinction." So he's talking about slavery. "Thus the agitation may cease. It may be pushed forward until it shall become alike unlawful in all of the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. I have said, and I repeat, my wish that the further spread of it may be arrested, and that it may be placed where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction. I have expressed that as my wish. I entertain the opinion, upon evidence sufficient to my mind, that the fathers on this government placed that institution where the public mind did rest in the belief that it was in the course of ultimate extinction. Let me ask why they made provision that the source of slavery, the African slave trade, should be cut off at the end of the 20 years. Why did they make provision that in all the new territory we owned at that time, slavery should be forever inhibited? Why stop its spread in one direction and cut off its source in another if they did not look to its being placed in the course of ultimate extinction?" Okay, so Lincoln brings up a lot of things that we've covered before in this class, right? So ultimate extinction, kind of like gradual emancipation, right? Saying like, over time, slavery will eventually end. right? He's not saying we're going to get rid of slavery right now. He says eventually it's got to end. And he hopes that we limit it so that it doesn't spread and that people have an easier time getting rid of it. He also brings up two examples of, and this is the kind of thinking I want you to do for your exam, right? As you saw from your midterm. He brings up two examples of the U.S. sort of stopping slavery, right? One, the clause in the Constitution where they would end the slave trade in 20 years, right? He says, why would they do that? They didn't want slavery to be gone. Two, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, right, which stopped slavery from spreading into the Northwest territories. So Lincoln's using these great examples from history in order to prove his point that we've been on track for getting rid of slavery. It can only continue from there. And here's another picture of Lincoln doing these debates. Okay. And that's how they did it, right? You didn't really have chairs in the audience. The audience stood there for hours listening to them talk, and yeah. And then here's another picture just for fun. Remember, because they did like 7. So 7 or 9, whatever. Okay, so our last topic for PowerPoint 10, but not the last topic for today, so don't get too excited, is Mr. John Brown. Now, as I mentioned before, John Brown was the first man to be executed for treason in this country, so we're going to talk about why that was so. And John Brown never smiled in pictures because, like Harriet Tubman, he had too much to do. So here's John Brown closer to the time of his death. John Brown was born on May 9th, 1800, and he was executed on December 2nd, 1859. And he was an American abolitionist who believed in and advocated armed insurrection, aka like a rebellion, right, except with more weapons, as the only way to overthrow the institution of slavery in the United States. If you take a look at video B, there's some more information on John Brown and how he was inspired by the bloodbaths that were going on in Bleeding Kansas. He first gained attention when he led small groups of volunteers during the Bleeding Kansas crisis of 1856. He was dissatisfied with the pacifism of the organized abolitionist movement, and he said about the abolitionists, "These men are all talk. What we need is action, action." So this guy was a actions speak louder than words type of dude. In May 1856, Brown and his supporters killed 5 supporters of slavery in the Potawatomi Massacre, which responded to the sacking of Lawrence by pro-slavery forces. So he wasn't afraid to kill for the cause. In October 1859, Brown led a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which today is West Virginia, intending to start a slave liberation movement that would spread south through the mountainous regions of Virginia and North Carolina. So basically, which we've kind of mentioned this, right? Harriet Tubman helped John Brown recruit freed black people for this raid. He wanted to start an attack that was so big that it would inspire slaves all across the country to rise up against their masters. Okay, he wanted one huge slave rebellion. He seized the territory, but 7 people were killed and 10 more were injured. He intended to arm slaves with weapons from the arsenal, but only a small number of local slaves joined his revolt. Okay, so he didn't get the following that he needed. Within 36 hours, those of Brown's men who had not fled were killed or captured by local farmers, militiamen, and U.S. Marines. Those Marines were later led by Robert E. Lee, who, interestingly enough, was the top general for the Confederate Army later on. He was hastily tried for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, the murder of 5 men, including 3 blacks, and inciting a slave insurrection. He was found guilty on all counts and was hanged. He was the first person convicted of treason in the history of this country. And this is a picture of John Brown kissing a black child before he goes to the executioners, the noose. Historians agree that the Harper's Ferry raid and Brown's trial, both covered extensively by the national press, escalated tensions that led to the South secession a year later and the American Civil War, right? Because the only thing that the Southern planters were scared of more than black people rising up were white people helping black people rise up. Brown's raid captured the nation's attention. Southerners feared that it was just the first of many Northern plots to cause a slave rebellion that might endanger their lives, while Republicans dismissed the notion and claimed that they would not interfere with slavery in the South. He is both memorialized as a heroic martyr, which means somebody who died for a cause, and visionary, and he's also vilified or hated as a madman and a terrorist, so it depended on who you asked. But that was John Brown. He was super badass. So here's a flyer sort of in support of Brown. They say, treason. All true Christians who believe in immortality through Jesus Christ alone are requested to pray for Captain John Brown, who is now is under sentence of death and is to be hung next month for righteousness' sake, and doing justly with his fellow man, his country, and his God. By request of one who loves the truth and feels of the man that is to die a martyr to it. Basically, letting all the abolitionists know, like, hey, John Brown's like awesome, but he's gonna die and this sucks. And these were John Brown's last words, which I think are cool. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it could be done. So basically, this dude's on the scaffold ready to get hanged, and he's like, I wish I would have killed more people. I should have done that. What a badass, honestly. Anyways, so that's the end of PowerPoint 10. So let's move on to PowerPoint 11. The Civil War. Okay. So you guys may know like the gist of the Civil War, right? But we're going to get a little bit more into detail, particularly when it comes to Black people, which we'll cover in our next lecture. But what we're going to do now is sort of give a brief overview of the Civil War, and we'll also talk about why the South left and also what Lincoln's specific goals were in this war, because it's something we really need to consider. Here's my favorite picture of Lincoln again, right? So Lincoln, of course, was the head of the Union, elected in the 1860 election, came into the presidency in 1861, which triggered Southern secession, meaning several states left because they feared what Lincoln would do, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. The Southern secession led to the formation of the Confederacy, or the Confederate States, led by this man, Jefferson Davis, who was their president. And Jefferson Davis and his vice president and others in his Confederate cabinet blatantly said that Southern secession was to preserve slavery, right? So if anybody tells you that the Civil War was not about slavery, they are absolutely 1,000,000% wrong, okay? I've had people, unfortunately fly a Confederate flag, and I've asked them about it, and they said, well, it's about Southern heritage and the Civil War and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, this was about slavery, And they're like, no, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. It was to preserve Southern heritage and Southern culture. And I'm like, well, Southern heritage and culture was like slavery was ingrained in that identity, as we've talked about in this class, right? So, some people. This is what the territories eventually look like. So everything in blue is the Union, okay, all free states. Everything in red is the Confederacy, all slave states, and everything in this sort of gray color are the the border states. So the border states were the most important to Lincoln in the Union because they could flip at any time. Okay. Also, Washington, D.C., right, was sort of in Confederate/border territory, so it was very important for those territories to remain either impartial or to join the Union. And of course, the Confederate flag came from that, which we'll see another picture of that today, and there's also great debate about the Confederate flag as well. Usually in class, I show my students a video. If you look up John Oliver, if you want, this is optional, John Oliver's show Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. And if you look up his episode about the Confederacy, he talks about the flags and statues and stuff that we still have around today and how people want to get rid of them, the debate about that. You know, it's a very funny episode. So the Civil War kicked off with an attack on Fort Sumter, I believe in Florida, and the Confederates took over that fort, and that led Lincoln to ultimately declare war. This is General Robert E. Lee, who I believe I mentioned is a relative of George Washington's through George Washington's aunt. He's a 5-star general. And even though he fought for the Confederacy, he was a very practical man, right? He knew when he was defeated. He often talked to others about not wanting to build monuments of him because he didn't believe in that. So very, very smart man. And this is the foremost Union general and future president, Ulysses S. Grant, who was instrumental in helping continue the Reconstruction period, which we will talk about in our 12th PowerPoint. Okay, he's also kind of an alcoholic. We'll also be talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, but probably in our next lecture. This freed the slaves in 1863, which made a huge difference in the war, and we'll talk about that. You also have the Battle of Gettysburg, which we'll talk about as well. This is a picture from the actual battlefield, one of the most haunted places in the U.S., I think I mentioned before, and how this battle really turned the tide of the war, right? The Union victory led to a upwards trajectory of victories that led the Union to win. Finally, the South surrendered in 1865, marking the end of the Civil War, and it was up to the Union government to make sure that the South could be integrated back into, I don't know why I said it like that, integrated. Sorry, getting off topic. But integrated back into the U.S., right? But still kind of punishing them because they can't just come back and we forget that they committed treason against the United States, right? The South had to sort of prove their worth for a few years. That was partially through the Reconstruction period. And of course, as we mentioned before, it felt like the war was officially over with the assassination of President Lincoln. So this PowerPoint feels pretty long to you guys maybe because I had a lot of pictures explaining things, but it's pretty average for what we've been doing, so don't feel like I'm giving you a bunch of work all of a sudden. So Union dissolved, right? This came out in the newspaper as the southern states started to leave. Okay, so let's talk about why they did that. So the Confederate States of America, aka the CSA or CS, commonly referred to as the Confederacy, was an unrecognized country in North America that existed from 1861 to 1865. The Confederacy was originally formed by 7 secessionist slaveholding states. So these are the 7 original states that left: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, whose economy was heavily dependent upon agriculture, particularly cotton, and a plantation system that relied upon the labor of African American slaves. Now, you can see this is an ordinance of secession um, of some men that wanted to split from the Union. Convinced that white supremacy and the institution of slavery were threatened by the November 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln, the Confederacy declared its secession from the United States, with the remaining states becoming known as the Union during the Civil War. Okay. So those debates that Lincoln had gone through before, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, helped Lincoln become president, but it also convinced the South that he was going to get rid of slavery, so they should split. According to Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens in his famous Cornerstone speech, Confederate ideology was essentially based upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This is often brought up when, again, people try to argue that the Civil War was not about slavery. There's literally the Confederate vice president saying it's about slavery, right? And this white power complex. So yeah, debunked. Before Lincoln took office in March, because back in the day, presidents would step into the office in March. Now they step into it in January. A new Confederate government was established in February 1861, which was considered illegal by the government of the United States. States volunteered militia units, and the new government hastened to form its own Confederate States Army from scratch practically overnight. After the American Civil War began in April, 4 states of the Upper South, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, also seceded and joined the Confederacy. The Confederacy later accepted Missouri and Kentucky as members, although neither officially declared secession nor were they ever largely controlled by Confederate forces. So Missouri and Kentucky were Confederates in name only. Confederate shadow governments attempted to control the 2 states but were later exiled from them. The government of the United States rejected the claims of secession, considering it illegitimate. And the Confederacy never became a formal government because there wasn't really other countries who were willing to declare them as a new country, right? Remember, if a new country comes about, you have to have another country basically acknowledge that you're a new country, or you're not. Okay, and the other countries I don't think wanted to mess with the Union. The war began April 12th, 1861, when the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter. I said it was in Florida. It was in Charleston, South Carolina. I get it mixed up with another fort that was attacked around the time. No foreign government officially recognized the Confederacy, as I mentioned, although Great Britain and France granted it belligerent status, which allowed Confederate agents to contract with private concerns for arms and other supplies. So basically, Britain and France, who we'll talk about a little bit more, wanted to keep the Confederacy around, so they didn't consider it a formal country, but they did give it special status so that they could ask for help against the Union, and we'll talk about that. In early 1865, after 4 years of heavy fighting, which led to 620,000 to 850,000 military deaths, all Confederate forces surrendered. Nearly all Confederate forces had been forced into surrender or deliberately disbanded by the end of 1865. Okay. Jefferson Davis lamented that the Confederacy basically disappeared. So there was no really huge defeat of the Confederacy. It just lost its money and resources over time and basically failed. Right? So if you take a look at video C, there's more details about Lincoln's election and the connection to Southern secession. These are the Confederate states, sort of in an old map style. There are organizations of people who are proud of their Confederate ancestors even today. Although, I need to remind you guys, like, this is treason. Right? It wasn't just like, oh, they decided to split and we fought them and they came back and it was all good. No, like, They literally committed treason against the United States. They were enemy power for 4 years, right? And so there's not a lot of countries where people celebrate committing treason against the country that they claim to be a citizen of, right? United States is very unique in that way. And also, flying the Confederate flag is acknowledging a treasonous flag, right? So it's very unique, because like you don't see like Nazi flags everywhere in Germany and people saying, "Oh, I'm proud to be descended from a Nazi." No, or else they do that underground. But I don't know. It's just a weird culture in the United States. We're finally starting to sort of address it. So the last topic for today, we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln and what his goals were for this war. Because, he's the main guy for this war. It's super important that we know what his thought process was, how we won the war, stuff like that. So here is another picture of Lincoln visiting one of these Union camps, which is pretty cool that we have these pictures, and you can see how much taller he is than everyone around him. George Washington was tall too. He was like 6'1" or 2. So here's a picture I've shown you before. If you take a look at video D, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Lincoln starring Daniel Day-Lewis. I've heard it's very excellent, right? I've seen some of it. But basically, this is a clip of Lincoln arguing with his advisors because we'll talk about with the Emancipation Proclamation, it wasn't legal, technically, because that's something Congress should have passed, but Lincoln actually passed it himself, which a president isn't supposed to do, but people weren't necessarily arguing with him during war. So this clip is of him arguing with his advisors for the need for this. So at first, when the Civil War broke out in 1861, Lincoln wanted only to preserve the Union and bring the southern states that had seceded back into the Union, so he wasn't thinking about slavery. He just wanted the country to be the United States again. His premise at the outset of the war was that the Confederate States had no right to secede, that their actions were treacherous, and that the Union was justified in trying to bring the Confederacy back into the nation. However, as the Union Army began fighting, Lincoln realized that the war would be difficult to win. It became necessary for him to provide a rationale, grounded in democracy, to motivate the Union troops in the North and to provide a broader context for fighting in the war. So basically, Lincoln eventually had to realize that a lot of soldiers aren't going to put their life on the line just because you want to bring the southern states back in. They don't get that it's necessary. So he's like, I need to figure out something that's going to get people on my side and make them want to fight. So in 1862, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which took effect in 1863 and freed the slaves in the Confederacy. Okay, so mainly the Emancipation Proclamation we'll talk about later worked to free slaves that weren't under Union control. Like, they kind of freed the slaves in the Union too, but they sort of declared that all the slaves in the Confederacy were free as well, even though they had no authority to do that. So it's kind of interesting. Though it was largely symbolic in action, again because they couldn't control Confederate slaves yet, it signified Lincoln's eventual commitment to ending slavery and providing a more meaningful rationale for fighting the deadly and long Civil War. So basically, the Emancipation Proclamation was a great war tactic, because not only are you getting people something to fight for, but also all of those slaves that you're potentially freeing could join your side. In addition, Lincoln knew that by supporting the abolition of slavery, he would make it difficult for European powers such as England to support the Confederacy. This is because there is a strong abolitionist sentiment in England. So here's the scoop, okay? Here's the tea. Places like England and France, who I just mentioned wanted to help the Confederates, did so because they liked all that cotton, right? Like 80% of England's cotton during that time came from the South. If the South lost the war, and lost all that continent slave labor, England would have a huge deficit, right? So Queen Victoria of England low-key sent some ships to the Confederates to help them win the war. But that was bad because, again, England, like, became abolitionists way before we did. So that's, like, contrary to their belief, right? If you want to get rid of slavery, why are you helping the South? At the outbreak of the Civil War, Lincoln declared that his main goal was not to free slaves, but then it changed because of the first few terrible years of the war, right? A lot of people died. So Lincoln once said, if I could preserve the Union, okay, wait, let's go to that real quick. If I could save the Union or preserve the Union, there's two different accounts. Without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere should be free. So basically, Lincoln is declaring himself an opportunist, right? He's saying, whatever situation calls for, I'll do it, but I'm really not taking a position. And of course, Lincoln expected that these freed slaves would join the Union and boost their numbers because they lost a lot of soldiers because close to 1 million people died, right, throughout this war. So Lincoln actually didn't shift his beliefs so much. He just finally realized that both the aims of getting the Union back together and freeing the slaves complemented each other and led to his ultimate goal. And that's what you have to do in war, right? You have to figure out what's the best option, what do I need to do, what's going to make a big impact. And that's what he did. Okay. So technically he is the great emancipator, right? He did emancipate the slaves. He did push for the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves officially. But it's false to think that Lincoln always was gung-ho on doing that, basically. Okay, here's that quote again. So that's the end of today's lecture, okay? So we're going to continue with PowerPoint 11 next time by getting more into what African Americans actually did during the war, okay? And how they served and what their motivations for doing so were as well, which you guys can figure that out, but, we got to talk about it.